for participating today. And now I'd like to introduce Seth Lechny, General Plan Guidelines Project Manager, Governor's Office of Planning and Research. And the title of Seth's presentation is Introduction to CEQA.
Thank you very much, Laura. Happy to be here today. Happy to provide an overview of CEQA for state agency staff. In addition to being the General Plan Guidelines Project Manager, I'm also a staff of the State Clearinghouse. And I'll get into a little bit of detail about what the State Clearinghouse does and what OPR does as it pertains to CEQA. But we are, one of our tasks is to provide technical assistance and training to state agency staff, to consultants, and to the general public. So I'll jump right in here to the presentation. First, just a real quick overview on the Office of Planning and Research and what it is that we do. We are a branch of the Governor's Office. We're considered the statewide planning and land use agency by statute. Like I said, we participate in CEQA implementation and technical assistance. We also have a few other duties, including environmental justice, military affairs, and generally we function as a policy research arm of the Governor's Office, especially as it pertains to land use and environmental planning. A real quick overview of what I'm going to talk about today. Get started basically with what is the California Environmental Quality Act, what are its main objectives, when does it apply to certain projects, and what is the CEQA process for implementation. As Laura mentioned, I'll talk about two new bills and how they might relate to the work that DTSC does, and then I'll finish off with a little bit of a discussion about OPR's role in the State Clearinghouse and how it functions. So what is CEQA? It is California's most important environmental law. It's set a requirement that state, local, and other government agencies evaluate the environmental impacts of their actions. This is something that's fairly unique to California. There are other states that have environmental quality laws that require this type of analysis, but nothing in the level of detail and information that CEQA requires. So the CEQA foundations basically come from the CEQA statutes, the Public Resources Code. That's where the law itself resides. The CEQA guidelines are the regulations that are implemented through our office and the Natural Resources Agency that basically give a clearer view of CEQA and how it's meant to be complied. Case law is also a foundation of CEQA. There are many court decisions that have changed the way that lead agencies comply with CEQA, and also public agency implementation, just kind of the regular processes that public agencies go through. Kind of is a foundation of CEQA compliance and how it's done throughout the state. So the main objectives of CEQA, and there's quite a few, but I think it's important to point these out. Probably first and foremost, CEQA is meant to inform decision makers in the public. When a public agency is taking an action, CEQA is the evaluation of the, the environmental impacts of those actions, and that's meant to be used so that the decision maker is aware of what the consequences will be of their actions. It's also intended to bring the public into the process in a couple different ways and make sure that they are aware of what their government agencies are approving. Second, it's meant to identify ways to avoid and reduce environmental damage. There are requirements for mitigating the environmental impacts wherever it's feasible, and obviously the overall objective of CEQA is to make sure that the environment is not overly damaged by development and growth. Third, it's meant to prevent environmental damage by requiring feasible alternatives or mitigation measures. As I mentioned, the requirement to mitigate really is the ability to reduce the environmental damage caused by decisions. Fourth, it discloses to the public the reasons why an agency is approving a project with significant environmental impacts. That's kind of a main focus of an EIR, Environmental Impact Report, is that even though there is a significant impact, the government agency can still approve the document as long as they're stating the reasons why. It's meant to foster interagency coordination in the review of projects, which I'm sure is something that DTSC participates in as responsible agencies. The idea is that These agencies are meant to be talking to each other and discussing what it is that, what the impacts of their projects can be and how they can work together to come up with mitigation measures and alleviate some of those environmental impacts. And then finally, enhancing the public participation in the planning process. There's also, in addition to kind of brick and mortar projects, planning documents also need to go through the CEQA process, which means that the environmental impacts of those planning processes are also meant to be evaluated and analyzed, thus bringing the public into those processes from another angle as well. So when does CEQA apply? CEQA applies to discretionary activities proposed to be carried out or approved by California public agencies. So essentially any city, county, special district, state agency, any government agency in California is required to comply with CEQA when they are using their discretion on a project. And I'll get into a little bit about the definition of discretionary actions in a second. CEQA applies to private activities that require discretionary government approvals. So a private entity wants to build something, build a housing project, build a police station. Well, not necessarily a private police station, but building housing, commercial areas, industry, any kind of activity where a government agency needs to basically sign off and say, yes, this is something that you can do. CEQA applies to that action as well. So CEQA defines the activities that are considered projects. So according to the CEQA guidelines, a project is the whole of an action. So we're not talking about, if it's a housing development, we're not talking about just clearing the land and building the homes. We're talking about the environmental impacts of having those homes there and what will happen once people are living there and driving around in those areas. We're also talking about a project needs to result in either a direct physical change to the environment or a foreseeable indirect physical change to the environment. So again, a housing project that is taking sensitive habitat out of use would be a direct physical change in the environment. A planning document is something that would lead to foreseeable indirect physical changes to the environment. So a general plan that's adopted that sets certain land uses in new areas and projects new growth will lead to foreseeable indirect physical changes to the environment once that plan is implemented. So again, definition of a project, just getting into a little bit more detail. An activity that's directly undertaken by a public agency is a project under CEQA. So I guess my example of a police station there would be something that would be appropriate under this definition. If a city plans to build a police station, that city is in charge of approving that project. Therefore, it meets the definition of project under CEQA. Also, some other types of projects that fit under this definition are there as well. So any kind of public works, any kind of planning activities, amendments and adoption of general plans, those all fit the definition of a project based by being activities that are directly taken by a public agency. And then the second part, again, pertains to the idea that it needs to be an action that is supported through contracts, grants, subsidies, loans, or other kind of assistance from a public agency. So if an agency is giving out grant funds, that is something that would trigger CEQA compliance if those grant funds are being used for something that has a direct impact on the environment. Also an activity that involves the issuance of a lease or a permit or a license from a government agency, that falls under the definition of a project under CEQA. So again, that's how those private activities require CEQA compliance, is when a government agency has to sign off or approve that action. So a discretionary project, it means a project which requires the exercise of judgment or deliberation by a public agency. So that's an important concept to keep in mind because there are activities that governments can take that don't meet this definition. And usually the example that we like to say is when it's almost a checklist approach that a government agency is using. Has the applicant or proponent done 5 or 6 different things? If the answer is yes, then their action is approved. Discretionary projects are something where the government agency has to say, do we approve of what they're doing? Is this something that we're willing to allow? So is there a design element that's involved in the private action? Is there a permit that needs to be granted where the lead agency needs to review data or technical information and say, based on this information, we think this is a project that should happen? That's where the discretionary idea comes in. So just a couple quick examples of discretionary actions: zoning variances, use permits, subdivision maps, all generally ideas that are discretionary actions. A non-discretionary action would be something like a building permit, which for the most part is that checklist approach. Or a business license, where if a building exists and someone proposes to put a business in that building, if they're only looking at, if the lead agency is only looking at the 5 or 6 things that business needs to do in order to get into the building, then that would be a non-discretionary action, and there wouldn't need to be a CEQA action taken on that. So just some examples of non-projects that I've listed here. If an activity can be seen with certainty that there's no environmental effect, that's something that's very subjective. Probably, I think generally CEQA, that's not necessarily a determination that most lead agencies will make when they're looking at an activity. Actually, proposals for legislation from the state legislature don't need to go through CEQA. That's a non-project. And then continuing administrative or maintenance activities are not projects subject to CEQA. So the next thing I want to define and get into in a little bit of detail is the idea of a lead agency. The lead agency is really the public agency with the principal responsibility to carry out or approve the project. The lead agency is the one who decides basically whether a project is exempt, whether it's a project or not a project, whether an EIR or a negative declaration has to be done. The lead agency is really the agency that is kind of taking the first steps on CEQA compliance and making decisions on what type of document will be used. A responsible agency is another term that you'll hear quite frequently for CEQA. And really where a responsible agency comes into play is when you have a project that requires multiple approvals from multiple government agencies. So going back to our housing example, housing being built on sensitive habitat will probably require a permit from the Department of Fish and Wildlife, but the Department of Fish and Wildlife is only looking at those impacts to habitat. They're not looking at things like traffic or air quality or any of those other issues that will happen with that housing development. So given its singular role in approving the project, the Department of Fish and Wildlife would be a responsible agency, while the city that is kind of granting the overall approval of the housing development would be the lead agency. So there are some responsibilities that come up with being a responsible agency, and I think I'll get into those in a second. Trustee agency is another term that's used under CEQA, and it's a little bit, it's mainly a little bit of a way to make sure that some of these state agencies that hold resources in trust in the state of California are able to be involved in CEQA projects, even if they're not necessarily a responsible or a permitting agency. The CEQA guidelines lists for the 4 state agencies that I have here as being trustee agencies, but it's not limited to those 4. And again, a trustee agency will get involved in the project kind of in a similar way as a responsible agency, even though they don't necessarily have that discretionary approval over a project. So moving into the process under CEQA, I like to include this little flow chart here, mainly to show that there are quite a few steps that need to be taken in order to comply with CEQA. And this might look a little bit intimidating, but after it's kind of been gone, after the process goes through a number of times, it's not something that's as difficult to explain. And I'll get into the details about this, but I do like including this in the presentation. So the preliminary review, and this is when the kind of start of the CEQA process. An application would need to be submitted to the lead agency if it's a private project. If it's a public project, it would be basically the lead agency's decision to say, yes, we're going to move forward and we're going to build this, or we're going to come up with this plan. So the first thing that the lead agency is going to need to do is determine whether the project is subject to CEQA. Is it one of those non-discretionary actions that they can approve this project without any kind of discretion, or is it something that's going to need, that a decision is going to need to be made by the lead agency? The second step would be to review for exemptions, and I'll get into some of the exemptions here. There's a couple different kind of exemptions. The first is a statutory exemption, and those are basically created through legislative action. CEQA, being in the Public Resources Code, there are certain actions that the legislature and governor have basically put into law that says this is something that does not need to comply with CEQA. Basically, I've listed a couple here of statutory exemptions that have been included, but the example I usually like to talk about is in 1984, the legislature and governor decided that any activity pertaining to the Summer Olympics in Los Angeles was exempt from CEQA. They said, we're not going to, this law is not going to apply to the actions that need to be taken. We want to make sure that the Olympics go through without delay. And so they just basically filed a statutory exemption and said none of these activities need to comply with CEQA. So the legislature has the ability to basically make a blanket exemption for certain activities. The second type of exemption is what's called a categorical exemption, and those are in the CEQA guidelines. And basically, CEQA allows the Secretary for the Natural Resources Agency to determine what types of activities generally will not have an effect on the environment. So at this point, there are 33 categorical exemptions, and these are usually a little bit more applicable to certain activities. So just a couple of examples. There's a categorical exemption for the replacement of an existing building. If you're tearing down a building and replacing it with a similar building on the same footprint without any real changes, that's something that's categorically exempt from CEQA and can be done. Small habitat restoration projects are categorically exempt. There's a couple of exemptions for infill development, some of which that have kind of a strict definition, but are something that basically the Secretary of Resources has decided is exempt from CEQA. So once a project is determined to be exempt, basically the lead agency can move forward with approving the project. So they'll go through whatever their approval process is. If it's something that has to be approved by a city council or elected officials, they can basically move forward without any type of CEQA compliance. What happens once they've decided to approve the project, they have the option to file what's called a notice of exemption, and that's basically a one-page paper that explains what the activity is that's exempt from CEQA, what the exemption that's being used is, and basically what that does is it opens up a legal challenge period where someone, if they disagree with the use of the exemption, could challenge it in court. So the notice of exemption really is kind of the quickest, fastest, easiest way to come for CEQA compliance, but it's only for certain projects that are generally considered not to have a significant effect on the environment. So if the lead agency looks through the statutory and categorical exemptions and decides that the project is not exempt, does not meet any of those definitions, an initial study is the first step that they need to take. And what the initial study is a preliminary analysis to really determine whether or not an EIR or a negative declaration or mitigated negative declaration is required. And if you take a look in the CEQA guidelines, Appendix G is the environmental initial study checklist. It basically is a long list of potential environmental impacts that the lead agency should consider when they're basically looking at and reviewing their project. So it'll list things like biological impacts, hazardous materials, fire safety is something that's being added to the CEQA checklist. But the essential idea is that it's meant to raise the raise the awareness to the lead agency that this is a potential impact. They need to review their project and determine whether or not the environmental impact is something that's needs to be studied further in CEQA. Are we doing okay, John? I want to make sure.
Yeah, we had a problem with someone not having sound. If you don't have sound on your computer, try rebooting your system and re-entering.
Okay. All right, so the initial study, the conclusions of that initial study is what will lead to the next step in CEQA compliance. Basically, one of 3 documents would be prepared after determining the potential impacts of the project. And I'll get into the details of these type of documents. The first could be a negative declaration, and that's if the lead agency goes through all the potential environmental impacts and says that there is no impact by this project on the environment. The negative declaration is a fairly straightforward response that says this project will not have an impact on the environment. Now, what's essential to be included in a negative declaration is some reasoning or an explanation about why the project does not have an impact on the environment. So, as you're going through the initial study, you would need to say this project will not have an impact on air quality for the following reasons, and that really is what makes up the bulk of the negative declaration. A mitigated negative declaration is a little bit different from a negative declaration. It's prepared when there are potentially significant impacts on the environment, but revisions to the project will avoid or reduce those effects to what's called a less than significant level. So as the lead agency is going through the checklist, they may say, well, it looks like this project could have an impact on some sensitive wildlife habitat. Let's take some mitigation measures to make sure we can redesign the project. We can purchase some other land off-site that is equally sensitive habitat and preserve that for a long period of time. Any type of project change that will avoid these impacts is what would lead to a mitigated negative declaration. And then in a similar manner to a negative declaration, the lead agency is explaining how the mitigation measures work, how they'll reduce the impact. They'll also then basically state that for these reasons, an EIR does not need to be prepared. So what is an EIR? An environmental impact then is the third possible conclusion from the initial study. And what it is, is a detailed document that analyzes the project's potential significant impacts and identifies mitigation measures and reasonable alternatives to avoid these significant effects. Essentially, the EIR is required once all of the feasible mitigation measures are incorporated, a project still has an unavoidable impact on the environment, a significant unavoidable impact. So the EIR really is kind of the larger document that's going to need to be created because the lead agency is basically admitting that this project, if it goes forward, will negatively affect the environment. So they need to, while they also need to incorporate mitigation measures, there's also a few extra steps that they need to take to approve the project. And the first step is the notice of preparation. And that's something that's not included for negative declarations. It's pretty much a kind of a scoping document where the lead agency will say, this is what we're proposing to do. We think it will have a significant unavoidable impact on these areas. And we want to start the discussion with responsible agencies and possibly also the public to say what type of information do we need to include in our EIR to make sure that we're adequately covering all the impacts of the project. So a notice of preparation gets sent out. The responsible agencies have 30 days to reply, and then the lead agency from there can start working on the environmental impact report itself. So the contents of an EIR are different from a negative declaration. The neg deck is going to have that checklist. It's going to have the explanation of mitigation measures or explain why the project does not have a significant effect. The EIR has a lot more than the negative declaration. Essentially, it'll have the project description and environmental setting. It'll talk about some environmental impacts, including some effects that aren't necessarily required to be covered in a negative declaration. So the EIR needs to talk about some of the reasonably foreseeable indirect effects of the project. And by that, it means, let's say, for our housing development example, is this housing development being built on the edge of the existing community, and therefore would be something that down the line someone's going to say, well, now that we have people out in this area where it used to be natural habitat, now we need a shopping center, or we need more roads, or we need a highway extension so that these folks are able to move to and from their houses. That's a foreseeable indirect effect that needs to be analyzed in the EIR. A cumulative effects analysis needs to be included in an EIR, and that's where the lead agency, prior to approving the housing project, needs to look at other projects that are proposed around, near or around the housing development. So if this housing development is being proposed by one developer and there are 5 other proposed housing developments around it that are going through the process of getting approved, the EIR needs to analyze the cumulative impact, the impact of all of that development, and talk about the environmental impacts of all of that growth. And then again, growth-inducing effects, that's kind of similar to my example for foreseeable indirect effects. If the project will lead to more growth, that needs to be analyzed in the EIR. Similar to a mitigated negative declaration, the mitigation measures that are being incorporated in an EIR need to be explained. It's also worth noting that an EIR, even though it's making a determination that the environmental impact is significant and unavoidable, any feasible mitigation measures still need to be included in the project. The EIR is not like a blank slate where we can say, we're going to impact the environment and there's nothing that we can do about it. If there are actual mitigation measures that can be incorporated, even if it doesn't change that determination of significance, they still are required to be included in the EIR if they're feasible. And then finally, an EIR needs to analyze alternatives to the project. So again, with our housing development example, what if there were 50% fewer houses? What if they were, what if the land space that was taken up is reduced by a certain amount? What if there is no project at all? Those are all alternatives that can be discussed in the EIR, and basically the EIR will determine this is really the preferred alternative based on what's the purpose of the project and what are some of the things that make the alternatives kind of infeasible to move forward with. So as this process is going on, there's a public review for each of these documents. This is still while they're in they're in their draft format. As I mentioned, the notice of preparation for an EIR goes out for 30 days. Once that lead agency has completed their draft EIR and gone through all the steps, all the information that I just mentioned in the last slide, their EIR either goes out for a 30-day public review, or if the project is submitted to the state clearinghouse, a 45-day review where state agencies are also involved in looking at the document. More often than not, an EIR has some kind of state agency involvement. I don't think there are too many that go out for 30-day public review periods. You'll usually see a 45-day review period. For an EIR, yet another additional step is that the lead agency has to provide a response to all the comments that it receives within that 45-day period. So a negative declaration could receive 100 letters. There's no requirement for a lead agency to respond to each of those comment letters, but there is for an EIR. And if a public agency is commenting during this review period, the lead agency needs to get the response back to that public agency 10 days before approving the project. So that's something important to know for DTSC. If they're a responsible agency that has commented on an EIR, the response to those comments needs to come back at least 10 days prior to the project's approval. So don't expect to see a project be approved and your comments not be responded to. There's a little bit of an elevated requirement for public agency comment responses. So the negative declaration and the mitigated negative declaration similarly have to go through a public review period. Again, it's either 20 days or 30 days, depending on whether or not there's state agency involvement and the project is submitted to the state clearinghouse. There will be instances where negative declarations are for projects that don't require any kind of state agency approval, so there could be 20-day review periods for those draft documents. But it would be 30 days if it's submitted to the state clearinghouse, and I'll get into the state clearinghouse process a little bit later. So after all these steps have been made and gone through, prior to approving the project, the lead agency needs to consider the proposed negative declaration or mitigating negative declaration along with any of the comments that they received and make a couple of findings. First, they need to determine that based on the whole of the record, there's substantial evidence that the project does not have a significant effect on the environment. So that's the negative declaration. That's basically what it's saying, is that this project does not have a significant effect on the environment. And therefore the project can be approved. And also the lead agency needs to make a finding that the negative declaration or mitigated negative declaration reflects the independent judgment and analysis of the lead agency. So even though you'll see CEQA documents and draft documents prepared by consulting firms or maybe even prepared by a developer themselves, in the end, the public agency is required to basically make a finding and say, this is our judgment. This is what we as the city or county or state agency or special district believe to be the facts as it pertains to the environmental impact of this project. And then a similar process occurs to certify an EIR. Again, prior to approving the project, the lead agency certifies that the EIR has been completed in compliance with CEQA, that it was reviewed and considered by the decision-making body, and that it represents the lead agency's independent judgment. The additional requirement for an EIR is to include what's called a statement of overriding considerations, and that's where final EIR identifies these significant effects, and the lead agency states in writing why this project needs to be approved despite its negative impact on the environment. So that's where you'll see a lot of times maybe an economic argument that's made for a project. You know, someone could say this housing development, even though it's removing sensitive habitat, is needed for the growth of a city so that they can continue to grow and develop economically. It basically is a statement that says this is why we need to approve this project despite the environmental impacts. But it's important to note that CEQA isn't necessarily regulating development, and this is the way that lead agencies can still approve their projects even though the effect on the environment is significant. Basically, this gets back to that idea of CEQA being an informational document, a public statement that says that this project will have a significant effect on the environment, and the lead agency is choosing to move forward with the project anyway. Mitigation monitoring is an additional document that you might see in a CEQA document as well, and that's when if a project has maybe some complex mitigation that's required, there needs to be a statement that says who will complete the mitigation measures and when will those be complete. So essentially it's tagged on to a CEQA document to ensure that the mitigation is complied with in the future and who's going to be responsible for that mitigation. So finally, after approving the CEQA, certifying the CEQA document, approving a mitigation monitoring report, the lead agency can now finally approve the project. They basically, a lot of times what you'll see is the lead agency will approve the CEQA document and approve the project at the same time, maybe even in the same vote. So it's not like there's a time period between the two that have to happen. Generally, the project approval is going to be discussed at the same time as the CEQA document approval will be discussed. So once project approval has occurred, the lead agency has made its findings, and it's required to file what's called a notice of determination. And what that notice of determination is, it's basically a one-page document, a statement that says this project has been approved. It was an EIR, or a negative declaration, was used, and that, again, similar to a notice of exemption, opens up a challenge period for folks who maybe disagree with the CEQA document to challenge the project in court. Local agencies are required to file their notice of determination with the county clerk. State agencies are required to file their notices of determination with OPR, with the state clearinghouse, and it all has to happen within 5 days of approval. Some local lead agencies, if there's state agency involvement, also have to file their NODs with the state clearinghouse. So you may see multiple notices of determination for a single project if you've got multiple approvals occurring. Any questions before we move into some of the legislation?
Not yet.
Okay.
I would like to say, if you have a question, you can just type it in or use the raise your hand feature.
There's a hand that's up there.
And I sent a message to this person asking if they have a question.
Okay. Are we going to try to unmute them, or should we do anything?
The question is probably going to be coming in a typed form.
Okay. Well, whenever we get
forwarded.
Okay. Yeah, perhaps the individual needs to compose their message, so we'll be on the watch for it.
Okay. I did want to mention a few new legislation that's been approved in the past 5 or 6 years. And the main reason I want to do this is kind of PTSC's role, usually as a responsible agency. I want to make you aware of these new types of documents and some of the new analysis that's going to be occurring going forward. And so the first is Senate Bill SB 375, which is the Sustainable Communities and Climate Protection Act of 2008. And essentially what it sets out to do is use regional transportation plans, kind of combine them with land use plans to determine how to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from cars and light trucks. So the Air Resources Board sets targets, and these plans are intended to be approved by the regional governments to meet those targets. And the ARB certifies whether or not a plan that's gone forward with the plan is called a Sustainable Community Strategy, whether or not it has actually met the targets or not. So local governments are not necessarily required to adopt these regional land use plans, but they will receive benefits if projects that they approve are basically compliant with these plans. And the benefit that they receive has to do with CEQA, which is why it's in this presentation here. SB 375 created a new exemption for what's called transit priority projects, and there's a very long definition of what a transit priority project is, but essentially it's intended to be a project that's located near transit in already developed areas without any kind of special circumstances or situations, and it's something that could be exempt from CEQA. It also created what's called a Transit Priority Project Sustainable Communities Environmental Assessment. So that's what we're calling an SCEA, and it's really the new CEQA document. So it's not a NECDEC, it's not an EIR, but it's a project that is a transit priority project that also fits in with the Sustainable Communities Plan. And there's just a limited analysis in that SCEA. And there's another CEQA limited analysis just for mixed-use residential projects, and those are mixed use generally means a project that includes both kind of commercial development with maybe with some housing on top of it. If a mixed-use project also complies with an SB 375 regional plan, there are certain environmental impacts that it does not need to address, and usually that pertains to greenhouse gas emissions and traffic analyses. So not necessarily something that We actually haven't seen any of these used at this point. This bill was passed in 2008. The first round of regional plans came out probably 2 or 3 years ago for most of the regions, but we're yet to see a local government that's kind of taken the plunge and used one of these new documents yet. So the second bill I want to mention is Senate Bill 226. It was adopted in 2011, and it requires OPR to make CEQA guideline revisions for streamlining for an even broader range of infill development. And if you're not familiar with infill development, it's the idea of building within a community's existing footprint. So it could be an empty lot that's surrounded by already developed areas. It could be an underutilized lot with a building maybe that's not being used anymore. The idea that infill development is occurring inside the existing built-out area, as opposed to being built on the outskirts or on the far reaches of a city or a county. So essentially, in addition to the SB 375 benefits, SB 226 is used for an even broader range of infill development. It doesn't necessarily have to be located near transit like it does for SB 375. It applies to residential, office, commercial, schools, and mixed-use projects. So it's a little bit more broad than SB 375, but what it allows is for a limited analysis on certain environmental impacts. Here it is right here. Essentially, these projects need to be located in an area that's got lower vehicle miles traveled. So in an area where there's not as many people don't have to drive as far, that's where these infill benefits can occur. And I included this map here of yellow and green areas in the Sacramento region. These areas, this was done by the Sacramento Area Council of Governments, and it shows where some areas are that have less than average VMT. Yellow is the average VMT, and then red would be above average VMT. So projects that are located in these areas that are in green or in yellow are something that could potentially use the SB 226 infill streamlining. Did we have a question?
We have someone who says they have a couple of questions, but they haven't typed them in.
Okay. We'll try to make sure we get to your questions as they pop up. So essentially, the reason why here we have a couple questions. I thought I saw one just come up.
Said a couple questions, but they didn't answer the question.
Okay. Well, I'll just conclude with SB 226. That infill development is sometimes done in areas where a toxic cleanup needs to occur. These infill sites might be brownfields and require permits from DTSC. So it's important to note that the CEQA analysis might look different in a couple different ways. Normally, again, it's with greenhouse gas emissions and traffic. It might not necessarily affect the hazardous materials analysis that's usually included in a CEQA document. It's really it's not meant to necessarily kind of exempt these kind of things from review, but it is intended to kind of streamline the CEQA process for these type of projects that are getting built in existing areas. And the idea is that there's fewer environmental impacts caused by infill development, and the state wants to set, and SB 226 is really intended to incentivize cities, counties, developers to try to move forward with those types of projects without having to go through the entire CEQA process. So just a note that you may see CEQA documents coming down the line that look a little bit different because they're using SB 226 infill. And I think we talked at some time about doing a responsible agency training where we could get into a lot of detail about what that might imply, but I'm not necessarily going to get into the details about it today.
Yes, we do plan on having a session on that, probably in fall of this year. Okay, I think, are we ready to, are we able to unmute?
I've unmuted Paul Ruffin, so if you would like to speak your questions, I think we might be able to hear you.
it appears that Paul has gone ahead and typed in his question.
Oh, here we go. Excuse me. We have a question from Kevin. Please ask the speaker to limit the number of arcane acronyms. For example, what is SCS and VMT? In his presentation, he may have quickly stated these, but I missed it when he provided the definitions.
Okay. I'll real quickly go over it again, just so everyone's clear. The SCS is the Sustainable Community Strategy. So that's the regional plan that's required by SB 375 that looks at regional transportation and actually adds in a land use component. So the Sustainable Community Strategy is intended to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions. It's basically set up a scenario that would reduce the greenhouse gas emissions caused by future development from cars and light trucks. And then what was the other one?
Is it okay to prepare an initial study in neg deck even though the project qualifies for, I'm not sure what that would be, an EIR? Or an exemption?
Yeah, an exemption. Yeah, essentially, I mean, all CEQA compliance comes down to the lead agency's discretion. And if a project, if they, for whatever reason, determine that a project which normally would be exempt, but they want to go through the CEQA process, they want to get that type of input, they want to get the feedback from other agencies, there's certainly, there's nothing that stops them from creating an initial study and a negative declaration. It just adds more steps to the process of approving the project, but it's certainly within their discretion to do.
Okay, and we do have questions from Paul. Concerning the difference between a negative declaration and a mitigated negative declaration, when must the mitigating project changes be applied to the project?
That's really what would be determined in the mitigation monitoring report. There could be a number of ways that it could be addressed. If it's a design change, the project could be redesigned prior to even being approved or prior to being built. If it's a kind of an on-site construction that mitigates an impact, it could be something that's built while the project is occurring, or it could be even something that's done after the project is completely built. It could be, I don't know, if habitat restoration could be done even after a project is complete. But that's why the mitigation monitoring report is set up, because it determines who is going to complete the mitigation and when are they going to do it by. So that would all be stated in the mitigated negative declaration.
Okay. And we have no other questions.
Okay, great.
As of right now.
We will check in one more time before I finish up. So the last thing I want to talk about is my office and our role in CEQA. And basically, the CEQA guidelines are prepared by the Governor's Office of Planning and Research. We have basically this slide outlines our role in CEQA in general. And the first and foremost is that we write the CEQA guidelines. We don't adopt them because we're not a regulatory agency, so that we hand them over to the Secretary for Natural Resources, who actually goes through the administrative law process and adopts the CEQA guidelines. But we are the primary author of the guidelines as they come out.
We do have a request that you repeat the answer to the question about, is it okay to prepare an initial study and negative declaration, even though the project qualifies for notice of exemption?
Sure. The answer is yes. The lead agency has its discretion to kind of choose whatever path it wants to go, and even if a project is something that would qualify for the exemption, the lead agency may want to have complete an initial study, get the feedback from the public and other agencies that it would normally get through that process, and take those extra steps. And they might just do that just to be sure that they're covering all their bases, that they've looked at every environmental impact. It could be a project that's got some opposition, something that may not be kind of a simple project, even though it meets that definition for an exemption. So essentially, the real answer is that the lead agency has the discretion to take whatever path they want to choose, as long as they're within the requirements of CEQA.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah, Gunther.
Yes, Seth. This is Gunther Moscat. I was wondering if you could clarify the exceptions to the use of exemptions. I think that would be useful.
Sure. There's a section in the CEQA guidelines prior to the categorical exemptions that talks about, and this is a great little tongue twister, the exceptions to the exemptions. And it's fairly broad. I mean, it says that if a project, if there are special circumstances surrounding a project, or if there are the potential for an environmental impact, that a categorical exemption cannot be used. So, you know, there are plenty of cases where this could be an example for, let's say it's a small habitat restoration that will have some other effect, or I guess I'm blanking on a real example here, but it's not as clear-cut as this project meets the strict letter of the definition of the exemption, and therefore it is exempt from CEQA. No, the lead agency should still consider, are there kind of special impacts? Is there some way that someone could argue that there's additional information that needs to be considered before we use this exemption? I think CEQA kind of wants is set up to have kind of a balanced approach, where even though it might be a small project that by the letter of the definition is in there, it wants the lead agency to take into consideration if there are any special impacts.
Thank you.
So getting back to OPR and CEQA, do we have another question, John?
We have no more questions.
Okay. A second of OPR's roles in CEQA is the identification of state responsible and trustee agencies. And this is something we do somewhat frequently. A lead agency will call up and say, this is what we're proposing to do. Are there any state responsible and trustee agencies that will be involved? And what we'll do is kind of go through our knowledge of state government and kind of what the roles of each agency are, and basically ask them, you know, are you doing it? You know, have you done a phase 1 environmental assessment, and have you determined if there's any toxic substances in the area? And if we get a yes answer, we'd say, well, BTSC is likely a state responsible agency, and you should here's some contact information for them. And in fact, I think we would send them to you, Gunther. So essentially, we're kind of the single point of contact that someone can call if they have questions about responsible agencies for their projects. And we'll get calls from developers, from lead agents, from local government agencies, a number of people who want to know who in the state might be interested in their projects. We also resolve lead agency disputes, which is a little bit of kind of an interesting exercise when two agencies are both claiming that they are the lead agency. OPR is really given the authority, and it's one of our really few authorities over CEQA to basically set the record straight and say, according to CEQA, this is who the lead agency is. Those don't happen all that often, but they're kind of interesting. And then we also maintain a database for environmental documents, and that is done through the State Clearinghouse, which is my next slide. The State Clearinghouse is housed within OPR, and what we do is coordinate the state review of environmental documents. You'll remember I mentioned for the public review of draft EIRs and negative declarations that there's a different time frame if the state agency is involved. What happens is if there's a state responsible agency, the draft document, EIRs and NEGDEC or NEGDECs is required to be submitted to the State Clearinghouse. And what we do is distribute those documents to state reviewing agencies. We have a list of what state agencies want, what type of documents they want to receive, and sometimes it's based on geography. You know, Coastal Commission wants everything on the coast, and sometimes it's based on the type of project. You know, BTSC wants projects that involve some kind of toxic cleanup. So we will, you know, using our discretion, we'll kind of take a look at the project and get a cursory review of what's being done, where is it being done, what are its potential impacts, and then decide, okay, these are the state agencies that should take a look at this document. And what we'll do is physically mail those documents out to the state agencies. We then establish what's called the state agency review period. which is the time frame that these agencies that have received the document can submit their comments. If it's an EIR, it's very important that you get your comments in during that time period so that the lead agency knows that you have the comments and that they'll be able to respond to your comments prior to approving the EIR. Okay.
We do have a couple of questions, if I can.
Okay, let me just get this last thing about coordinating state agency review. What happens once we get those state agency comments, we'll consolidate them and send them back out to the lead agency once the state review period is finished. So, okay, I'll take the question now.
We have a couple of questions. One is, what is the role of CEQA in terms of effect of the environment on a project?
That's something that's being, there's some recent case law that's kind of setting the stage for that. Essentially, there's a section in CEQA that gets into a brief discussion about the impact of the environment on a project, which I think when we did our last round of updates to the CEQA guidelines, it was to discuss greenhouse gas emissions. And we made some amendments to it to say, add some additional impacts that you might want to consider. For example, a coastal project in an area that's projected due to climate change for sea level rise might be something that's inundated in a certain number of years that's an environmental impact that might want to be addressed. There's case law that has kind of muddled that a little bit and has said that climate change impacts on a project are not necessarily required to be reviewed. It's a little bit of a gray area right now. I think sometimes you'll see an analysis done if it's a very specific project or maybe it's a specific concern, but there's not a clear-cut requirement that it be done.
Okay. Another question. All these provisions in CEQA are sound, reasonable, informative, protective, and well-tested. What are the changes to CEQA that are being debated, as reported in the press? And given these established provisions, how are they justified?
Well, last year I would say was, I think it's what's being referenced to the changes of CEQA. I guess the big picture answer to that is that the CEQA process is sometimes blamed for adding a lot of time, a lot of unnecessary delays to projects that may be important projects to get completed. So sometimes there's a complaint that this is something that slows down development and thus has a negative impact on California's economy. And so there's usually, it seems like it's kind of cyclical. Every couple of years, someone's talking about a complete overhaul of CEQA and how we can rethink how CEQA projects are done. The last proposal that I heard about really kicked a lot of the CEQA review back to the planning stage. So when a city or county was reviewing their general plan, that CEQA document would be basically completed so that it would be the one CEQA document, and then subsequent approvals, if they were compliant with that general plan, would not even have to go through an analysis of CEQA. So you're not looking at doubling the efforts for projects as they come in. Now there's drawbacks to that. You're basically putting all your eggs in one basket in that general plan EIR and saying that we're not going to review the individual impacts that might occur, and then also projects that get proposed aren't necessarily compliant with the general plan every single time. So what happens in that instance? But the idea generally when people start talking about CEQA reform is to kind of cut down that amount of time that it takes to complete the CEQA process. And I didn't really get into CEQA enforcement, which is done through the courts, but that's really where you can see a lot of the real slowdown occur when a project gets challenged. The court cases sometimes can drag on for long periods of time and be considered, again, something that slows down the economic progress in the state. The counter argument to that is that, yes, there are CEQA lawsuits, but there are also thousands of CEQA documents that are done that don't get challenged. Our office alone receives usually about 10,000 CEQA documents a year, and if you're looking at maybe a couple hundred legal challenges to those 10,000 projects that are proposed, it's a relatively small number. So it's not like every single project that's going through the talking about streamlining CEQA. It's usually to either cut down the lawsuits or really cut down the amount of time it takes to complete the process.
Okay, those are all the questions we have.
Okay.
Excuse me, John. I think I've seen a couple of new ones come in. One from Paul, and the message has disappeared, but I think we may have a couple new ones.
Okay. Why don't I just finish here while you take a look for those, John, and then I'll make sure we check at the very end.
Okay.
So then, as I mentioned, the State Clearinghouse distributes those documents. Essentially, the State Clearinghouse, again, projects are required to be submitted to the State Clearinghouse where an EIR has a lead responsible or trustee agency, where a state agency is lead responsible or trustee agency. So anytime there's state agency involvement with a project, it should have come to the State Clearinghouse. If, as a responsible agency, if DTSC staff sees a project that it requires your approval, you should be able to ask, have you sent it to the State Clearinghouse? What's the State Clearinghouse number? Has it gone through that process? Because your authority over that project triggers the requirement that it come to the State Clearinghouse for review. And then real briefly, I wanted to touch on the CEQA guidelines update that's occurring this year. We're undertaking a comprehensive review of the CEQA guidelines, which really hasn't been done in over 10 years. Some of this is being triggered by some new legislation for us to talk about, determine the analysis for automobile traffic. But there's other issues that we plan to address. We'll do some minor technical cleanups. We're planning on looking at the environmental setting and how that's defined in the guidelines, the lead agency determination, and there's actually a fairly extensive list of areas that we're looking to amend the CEQA guidelines. And so I'd encourage you, if you're curious about that or you want to take a look, the OPR website, I think we have a page dedicated to the CEQA guidelines update where we list all the potential areas that we're looking at amending the guidelines. And again, that'll be a year-long process where we'll come up with the draft language and changes to the guidelines, submit it to the Natural Resources Agency, who will then review it and then send it on to the Office of Administrative Law. So we're not talking about changes that would occur anytime this year. Probably at the earliest would probably be early 2015. But we are just looking to kind of take a look at the guidelines and see where does it need some better clarification, where does it need a little bit of an update, and then move forward with getting those changes adopted. So that's it.
That's it. No more questions.
I've got the OPR website up here on the screen, also my email address and phone number. We are, again, OPR is responsible for technical assistance on CEQA. Your department has an extensive environmental office, but if there are questions about our process or the State Clearinghouse or documents that come through our office, feel free to give us a call. We're happy to help out.
That for documents that are submitted to the SCH, State Clearinghouse, what should DTSC project staff do to ensure we receive documents that impact our project? Documents have been sent to SCR that impact our projects, but DTSC project staff were never notified of those documents. Also, is there a process for DTSC OPR to notify DTSC project staff that a document has been submitted?
First part of your question, generally, I can just say from experience, when I'm looking at a CEQA document, I'm looking at who are the responsible agencies first. If they're listed in the document, those get checked off. Second, I look at the environmental impacts, and if we're looking at a significant impact on hazards or hazardous materials, that section is always a key to me to get a document to DTSC. Now, we have a single point of contact that we send the documents to, so as some of the notification systems that you mentioned are kind of an internal discussion that your department would need to have. Kathy, if you want to weigh in.
Yeah, I can wait. Is this on?
Yeah, that's on.
Yeah. Hi, this is Kathy Schubelbein.
Seth is right. We do receive interested party documents, and they come to our office. We have identified people in our regional offices to whom these documents are sent. And then at that point, it is up to the regional offices to ensure that those documents get to the management or the project managers in those offices so that they can respond, take a look at them, see if we have any kind of a action that we may need to take, and then are also responsible for communicating with that particular agency. And so if you have any questions at all about that whole process, please contact our office.
One last thing to finish that question. We are working on a system for online submittal of CEQA documents, and this should be something that helps alleviate these problems. What we're setting up an entire system where a PDF of a CEQA document can be submitted to our office. Our office would then send it out to our contacts by email, and then from email it should be a little bit easier, and that'll kind of eliminate we basically send one copy to each department. So you may have a number of people that you want to review it, but you're basically getting one copy. This way it can be disseminated to a number of people. What we'll also be able to do is if the department doesn't want just a single point of contact, we can send emails out to everyone that you think should receive those documents on a daily basis. We're probably still another 6 to 10 months away from having that system up in place, but we are working on it.
One more question. Explain the significant requirements between federal environmental quality regulations and California CEQA requirements.
That's always fun. I guess the one level of government that I didn't mention for CEQA compliance is the federal government. They go through their own environmental review process that's called the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA. So federal agencies are required to comply with NEPA, whereas state, local, regional, governments are required to comply with CEQA. There's some difference in the analysis that needs to be done. I would generally describe CEQA as more extensive than NEPA, but the problem with NEPA is that it's basically, instead of having a CEQA guidelines that all of us follow, those federal agencies basically can determine how they want to create their system to comply with CEQA. So it really varies from federal agency to federal agency.
And a couple of significant differences are that for NEPA, when you analyze alternatives, you have to have the same level of detail for each of the alternatives. Also, if you have an environmental impact statement, the mitigation measures listed in that are not required, are not mandatory, and that's a difference from CEQA.
Yeah, and what you'll see is there's provisions in CEQA that talks about joint documents, so you'll have documents that comply with both. Sometimes the process isn't as smooth, and you'll see a NEPA document, separate NEPA and CEQA documents. But yeah, thanks, John. Those are a couple of the differences. I can't name them all off the top of my head. I try to learn about NEPA, but I don't want to get my wires crossed with CEQA. So generally, that's kind of my standard answer.
Okay. Do we have any more questions?
Yeah. Please raise your hand if you'd like to speak your question, or type in if you prefer. If you'd like to speak your question, then we can unmute you. Just let us know.
And I am going to stick around for the rest of the presentation, so if anything else comes up, happy to answer. Thank you very, very much. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Seth.